Hi, my name is Bill Johnston, and I am co-chair of the Affordable Housing Team at the First Unitarian Church of Hamilton. With the church board's approval, I made a presentation on behalf of the congregation to Hamilton City Council's General Issues Committee on Monday, February 8th, as part of Council's pre-budget consultations. The purpose of my presentation was to support the housing recommendations contained in the recently released report that calls for a just recovery for Hamilton, and to highlight a half dozen of the recommendations in that report. I am presenting here a slightly expanded version of that short 5-minute presentation. For our congregation, efforts to ensure that everyone has a safe, adequate, and affordable home is about human dignity and also the recognition that we are all interconnected, so that none of us can thrive unless all of us do. But the goal of everyone having a safe, adequate, and affordable home is beyond the grasp of tens of thousands of Hamilton households whose housing is either unsafe, overcrowded, or not affordable. One piece of the challenge is that we are losing affordable private sector rental housing far faster than we can build new units. The rapid loss of existing affordable rental units has been highlighted by housing consultant Steve Pomeroy, who was the keynote speaker at the city's 2019 Hamilton Housing Summit. Pomeroy has calculated the number of private sector units that rented for $750 a month or less that disappeared in the 5 years between the 2011 and 2016 census. $750 a month is affordable on an income of $30,000 a year. For the Hamilton census metropolitan area, which includes Burlington and Grimsby, Pomeroy calculated that we lost more than 10,400 of those relatively affordable rental units between 2011 and 2016. Hamilton has just under 80% of the rental units in the Hamilton CMA, so the city lost about 8,000 of those relatively affordable units in that 5-year period. Those losses are continuing, as Pomeroy has noted. The cases of Hamilton residents Bruce McPhee and David Pegg illustrate one way that this happens. As Tevye Morrow reported in The Spectator in December, McPhee has a 1-bedroom apartment in an 11-unit, 3-story apartment building at 816 Concession Street. He's a short walk away from the mountain brow with its panoramic view of the lower city. He's near a bus stop, and his unit, though simple, is comfortable, and it rents for just $750 a month. Unfortunately, his landlord has issued an N13, which is a notice seeking his eviction to allow major renovations that will include converting 1-bedroom units into 2-bedroom units. McPhee was offered $2,600 to leave by the end of April, but he was reluctant to accept since that payout would not go far with today's rental market. David Pegg's situation is similar. The Spectator reported that he and other residents in a building with about 60 units at 285 Melvin have received N13s and been told to move out by the end of March, again for major renovations. Pegg has been in his unit for about 15 years, and he pays just $633 a month in rent. He lives on a disability pension, and yet he wasn't inclined to accept the $4,000 he was offered to move out. As he told The Spectator, quotes, "We're fighting to stay because these are our homes." In the first 11 months of 2020, 49 N13s were filed with the Landlord and Tenant Board in Hamilton, compared to just 6 in all of 2012. Those figures only reflect cases in which the tenants actually challenged the proposed evictions. We lost most of those under $750 rental units because every time a tenant moves out, voluntarily or through eviction, the landlord can raise the rent, and they do, often by a lot. In 2020, Canada Mortgage and Housing reports that the average rent in the old city of Hamilton rose by 6%, almost 7 times the inflation rate in that year. With demand and supply stable, that increase was almost entirely the result of rent increases on vacated units. The loss of affordable private sector rental units far outstrips our ability to build, so far anyway, to build new units. Every 5 years, about 365 new affordable units get built in Hamilton. So we lost about 20 affordable private sector units for every new unit built between 2011 and 2016. One conclusion is that governments need to do everything they can to help tenants avoid eviction. In our presentation to City Council, I spoke in favor of several dozen recommendations related to housing in the Just Recovery for Hamilton report. That report was produced by a coalition of organizations in the city that are calling on City Council to ensure that everyone in Hamilton benefits from measures to cope with the pandemic and measures to ensure that a recovery from the resulting economic recession. That requires giving priority to marginalized groups and individuals who were disadvantaged before the COVID-19 hit and were hardest hit by the pandemic and lockdowns. Our presentation focused on steps to avoid evictions wherever possible. First, it urged that no one should be evicted because they lost income during the pandemic. Moratoriums on evictions, though necessary, are not sufficient. Tenants need financial help with those arrears, or they will end up being evicted. A recent Canada Mortgage and Housing Survey found that 2,700 tenant households in the Hamilton Census metropolitan area are in arrears, averaging $1,424 each. I urged Council to act on recommendation 53 in the Just Recovery for Hamilton, which calls for setting aside money in the 2021 city budget for a local rent bank to help tenants deal with arrears caused by COVID. But I also urged the city to push Queen's Park to cover those costs, as recommendation 52 proposes. Both Queen's Park and Ottawa have provided help to commercial tenants, but no relief to residential tenants. Both Ontario and Queen's Park are in budget consultations right now, with deadlines for comment of February 12th and February 19th, respectively. Second, no one should be permanently evicted because of renovations. Landlords have an obligation to allow tenants to return at their old rent if they move out for major renovations. Many tenants likely don't know of their rights, including that right. So I urged Council to budget to deploy staff and resources to adopt recommendation 60 to ensure tenants know their rights, and recommendation 54 to use all of the city's tools to ensure tenants get the opportunity to return to avoid the loss of any more of those affordable rental units. Acorn Hamilton has proposed that as the city receives requests for building permits to do renovations, it should ensure that the tenants of those buildings know their rights, and it should follow up to ensure that the tenants actually were able to return to their old unit if they wanted to. I also supported recommendation 51, which urges Council to budget for the staffing and resources for proactive building inspections to ensure that routine maintenance isn't neglected to the point that major renovations are required. Most inspections now are only done in response to complaints, but some tenants are reluctant to complain and risk their landlord's reaction. The presentation ended with a call for much more investment in new construction of affordable nonprofit, co-op, or public units, for renovations to existing affordable buildings, and for portable housing benefits that help tenants afford rent that is otherwise beyond their means. Those investments also need to include funds to allow nonprofits to buy existing buildings in order to keep the rent permanently affordable and avoid the steady loss of affordable units that was outlined above. Our presentation supported recommendation 55 of the Just Recovery Plan, which calls for more city capital investments in 2021 for new housing. But most of the money that Hamilton needs must come from much increased investments from the senior levels of government. The National Housing Strategy, introduced in 2017, marked an important return of the federal government to active support for affordable housing. But its goals and the size of its investment, at least to date, is far too limited. One overall goal is to help 530,000 Canadian households out of core housing need. But even if that were achieved, the goal would do nothing for 2/3 of this 1.6 million Canadian households that are in core housing need. The Ontario government has cut Hamilton's allocation for new or renovated housing to less than a third of what it had been before 2019. And even the original figure was far too little. And the amount of Canada-Ontario housing benefit provided so far will provide supplements to only about 350 of Hamilton's 16,000 precariously housed residents. People are considered precariously housed if they spent half or more of their pre-tax household income for housing, leaving very little for other essentials and almost nothing for any emergency. The pandemic has underlined just how vital it is for people to have safe, secure, uncrowded housing that they can afford. The need was great before the pandemic and is even more urgent now. Our governments must act in their current budgets. Please consider writing to our councillors, our MPs, and our MPPs to urge action. And please fill out provincial and federal pre-budget surveys, which can be found at addresses provided on our church website under the Justice tab. Thank you for listening.